more efficient processes and systems. Hi guys, welcome back to this month's journal article review. As always, we're here to talk about science and make it more practical for coaches, for sports scientists, for psychologists, for anybody in the fitness, strength and conditioning sports space. Let's talk about sports performance research, recent findings, interpreting them into our current practice. How can we implement them directly? But that's why we wrote this book, Strength Training for Soccer. I'm one of the co-authors for Chapter 9 with my colleague Ivy Casagrande. We wrote about off-season training. And this is an exact example of taking research, taking data, and taking a ton of experience and packing it into practice. So letting everything that we learn, letting the numbers, letting the experiences that inform your practice and constantly improving. So if that's something you're looking into and you work with any footballers, soccer athletes, this is going to be a tool for you. It's through NSCA and Human Kinetics. We don't get any money from it. This is obviously not a paid advertisement. We just wrote it for you and put it out there. So get it in your hands if you haven't already. The first article that we're going to review today, we're going to do 3, is by Florian Engel et al. 2022. It's called Repeated Sprint Protocols with Standardized versus Self-Selected Recovery Periods in Elite Youth Soccer Players. Can they pace themselves? This is a replication study, so it's replicating 2 other studies that previously used this exact same protocol. As we know in research, we always want to be able to replicate studies, and that's why we write everything so detailed so that they can be replicated literally exactly down to the point. And we always hope that we can then, under the same conditions, that we can then actually get the same results and that will then bolster the significance of the finding. Well, in this replication study, that wasn't actually the case. And they were actually doing it with the purpose of looking to see with their population if this was true, because they couldn't quite believe the findings. Especially those from Gibson, who found that when players self-select their own rest times, that they're actually going to rest for shorter periods of time, and that's then going to cause decrements in their performance, which doesn't completely make sense. Athletes, even if they're young, know how to self-manage, like know how to pick their rest time so that it doesn't actually give them a performance decrement. Like, why would they have shorter rest times so they actually sprint slower when the point is like to maximally sprint when they also have the opportunity to rest longer? That didn't really make a whole lot of sense, so they went ahead and replicated the study. All right, type of study was a random crossover design, which is great. Repeated sprint performance is critical in a lot of sports, but especially in football and soccer. And here they used a protocol of 10 times 30-meter sprints. And one group had then 30 seconds rest in between, and one group of athletes then got to pick their rest period in between. And Gibson, who wrote the 2017 article, had also hypothesized that these 30-second breaks, because 30 seconds are the approximate break in between sprints in a youth soccer match, he had hypothesized that because they're non-uniform, like that's just an average, we maybe need a little bit more, a little bit less, or we get a little bit more, a little less. Maybe those self-selected pauses actually replicate match play better. But again, in his study, athletes were taking shorter breaks and then having serious performance decrements. So they used 19 male soccer players. They were the U13 and U15 teams, so youth athletes between 12 and 14. They were running a 10 by 30 meter sprint protocol. They ran it the week before, right after their pre-testing, just to check and make sure that everybody knew what was going on, so that everybody had a little bit of repeated sprint experience before going into it. They split up the participants, and one group ran and had 30 seconds breaks, and the other one got to self-select their breaks in between. So at the beginning, they tested height and weight. They did a yo-yo intermittent recovery test to track cardiorespiratory factors. And then they also tested, of course, the sprint time, so how long it took in total, but also the individual sprints. They tracked heart rate, blood lactate concentration, and then the rate of perceived exertion, so before, during, and after. Not super surprising, but the self-selected recovery group actually ran faster sprints in total, had a better performance. On average, the rest period was 39 seconds. Interestingly enough, for the first half, the first 5 sprints, it was 36 seconds on average, and for the second half of the sprints, it was 41 seconds on average. And again, the first group was only having 30 seconds break the whole time through for all 10 sprints. The self-selected rest times group was significantly faster in total. What was, for me, extremely interesting was that their acceleration times were also significantly faster. So their 0 to 10 time was 2.003 seconds compared to the other group that was 2.079 seconds, and that doesn't sound like a lot, but it actually is significant. The performance for the first 5 sprints between groups were pretty much the same. It's really the second half where we started to notice the difference, and again, the self-selected group was then, on average, taking 41 seconds to recover, and the other group was then having 30 seconds to recover. The average RPE, so rate of perceived exertion, was also lower directly following sprints in the self-selected group, as well as blood lactate concentration. There was also a lower average heart rate in the group that was able to self-select, so pretty much everything is pointing to self-selecting brings a better performance. This is not at all shocking because sprinting, optimal sprinting, maximal sprinting requires rest. The longer you rest between sprints, the better performance you could bring. If you're only resting for 30 seconds, we know that is not enough rest for maximal sprinting, especially repeatedly, so you're simply going to have a significant performance decrement over the sprints. What I really liked about this study, though, is that they actually controlled with the yo-yo test for any aerobic factors. So to say that one of the groups was like aerobically insane, or that was what contributed to the rest times, was that they were just so aerobically fit. That was not the case. There were no huge correlations in between those. There were a couple of limitations. The primary one for me was just the question of whether or not these players had actually experience in RSA, so repeated sprintability training. Like, if they haven't done this a whole bunch before, maybe it's kind of difficult to regulate your sprint times, and the authors had already also mentioned this, but it's a really good study. They thought of pretty much everything. The practical applications, which is obviously the most important for anything we're gonna be doing here, the importance of internal load consideration. It's gonna be different for every single athlete. Every athlete who was in the self-select group picked a different rest interval, and their rest intervals were different between the different sprints. That's based on then their internal load, not just the amount of work, because everybody was doing the same amount of work. Everybody had the same amount of external load, so everybody was running 300 meters. But the internal load is what matters, because that's what changes up how quickly we recover, how recovered we even feel, any pain perception, exhaustion, etc. So those internal factors are so individual that maybe that actually calls for self-selected or individual rest times. There's also a question about pacing behaviors in youth athletes, which is what the original studies that were then replicated in this study had even asked, and that is, can youth athletes actually pace themselves well? Well, on average, when we talk about self-management and pacing behavior, that starts to come up between 15 and 17 that athletes can really pace themselves well. So these athletes were a little bit younger with 13 to 14, but that's okay. They seem to do a pretty good job. Also, these are not just amateur, random, recreational hobby youth players. These players are in an academy. They are highly trained, highly proficient. So maybe that also has something to do with it. It was also noted that when we train repeated sprintability in youth, we tend to use a lot more reps than are actually necessary, that actually come in a play in youth sports. Maybe we can use less volume and go for more effort. For me, the biggest takeaway from this study was that it always comes down to what you train and who you're training it with, that everything is always context specific. That if you're training for maximal sprinting, you will never, ever, ever get a good performance with 30 seconds break in between a sprint. It doesn't matter if it's 10 meters, it doesn't matter if it's 30, 50, 100. No. If you're going for a maximal sprint, you need significant rest. Self-selected rest periods can be a good option here if athletes can self-manage. Again, we just saw that as they're teenagers, they're learning how to self-manage and to pace themselves so that they do get a good performance and they're not just getting decrements because
I feel like I'm ready.
And they're not. If the goal is actually repeated sprintability, obviously we need a shorter break than what we would need for maximal sprinting, and we're gonna also expect that there's a performance decrement, even though that's what we're trying to minimize. So we can actually play around with the standardized 30-second or whatever the break is going to be, and then a self-selected break as well, depending on what you're trying to train. I really liked the study. I found it to be important. It's supporting the data that we already have saying maximal sprinting versus RSA, but it's adding in the factor of, can youth athletes also self-manage? This is important for me as somebody who trains youth athletes also in this age group and footballers and academies to see, can they self-manage? Can they self-pace? And can we trust their gut feeling and experience on their recovery and their performance? Is that accurate? Okay, study number dose. This is a brand new article. It's by Lowe et al. 2022. It's called The Role and Creation of Pressure in Training. Perspectives of athletes and sports psychologists. You know I love a sports psychologist. Opinion piece. Just kidding, this isn't anything but an opinion piece. This is actual research. I enjoyed the study. It's a thematic analysis study, which is different from grounded theory if you know anything about qualitative versus quantitative research. So the goal of the study was basically to find out how sports psychologists and athletes feel about pressure training. It wasn't just like to find out about it, it was also to find out what makes an effective pressure training scenario. Like, what is actually a good form of pressure training? What is actually just harmful? What doesn't work at all? What's completely ineffective? And what are the mechanisms behind it that make it helpful or not? Pressure training is an intervention to help athletes perform under high stress. So if you're an athlete who tends to get stressed out really fast in competition like me, hello, the anxiety doesn't just go away, but we can get much better at dealing with it. This is different from anti-distraction training. That has not been statistically found, as far as I know, and as far as these authors know, to help in competition at all or to reduce pressure. And a lot of coaches do think that they're building pressure in training, but it's not always effective. Sometimes the athletes find it to be totally ridiculous. Sometimes they find it to be offensive. Sometimes it's too much. Sometimes it's too strict. Sometimes it's not just pressure. Sometimes it's actually like straight up stress and anxiety or insecurity. Sometimes it's just pathetic and the athletes couldn't care less. It's not motivating at all. So we really want to find out how to be effective in this pressure manipulation so that we can use it best. Otherwise, if we're only getting 50% out of it, it's probably not worth our time. So previous types of pressure manipulations include, like, if you fail a task or score lower, or the losing team, they have to cook, they have to clean the locker rooms, they have to scrub down the showers, they have to run sprints, not start the next game, get their statistics posted on social media, have to admit on Facebook that they missed the penalty kick, stuff like that. These things aren't just meant to be unpleasant just for the sake of being unpleasant. They're actually meant to push the athlete for a specific reason, but sometimes they're just too mild and too temporary that the athlete is like, this is not actually pressure. And sometimes it's just way too much stress and way too often. Pressure training is not supposed to happen all the time. So they did a study with 8 sports psychologists and 8 international level athletes. They all had pressure training experience, and they did guided interviews, meaning that the author basically wrote an interview, one interview for all the sports psychologists, and wrote one interview for all of the athletes. And then they went through and answered the questions, and the researcher then had to code the answers according to what kind of answer they gave. What came out from this thematic analysis, so again, these themes that are just kind of woven through the interviews that they were able to code out, was extending the reach of the consequences. So not making them permanent, but also not making them temporary just for that training or just for that moment. Sometimes they need to be a little bit longer. For example, consequences that affected more than just the athlete doing the drill tended to actually bring significant pressure. That was effective. If your whole team or your whole group then suffers for just something that you did, if you missed the penalty kick, then the whole team has to cook, the whole team has to run sprints, and you know the stress of hearing other people be like, wow, I can't believe you missed that penalty kick. Even if they don't say that, and now we have to run sprints because of you, that can still be really stressful. It can be too stressful for some athletes who feel like they're then causing suffering to others and just cause them to completely choke out. But some athletes really need consequences that are then prolonged over the practice or drill. It's not just happening that one session, it's also the next session, it's also that week, it's also that season. Another point was simulating the psychological characteristics of a real life pressure scenario. So not just like the physiological ones where we run all the time, we're really tired, we're hot, sweaty, the temp is high. Those are all physiological. What about the psychological ones? Like, how can we get those things to mirror? And ones that actually mirrored competition psychologically and had those factors highlighted tended to actually be more helpful because they were most similar to competition level. And again, it wasn't just physiological. There was also this huge psychological element, and that's what's most important. That's the point of pressure training. For the physiological stress, the participants also said that approximating the amount of physiological stress in the competition can also be helpful, but it's even helpful if it's physiologically, so physically not as stressful as competition. Like, that can still be helpful. The primary thing is the psychological components of competition, to build that into the pressure manipulation. The next theme was benefits for athlete performance. In these pressure manipulations, they're learning coping skills. This is extremely important, that anxiety does not necessarily decrease by doing pressure training. We actually learn how to cope better with it, even if the anxiety doesn't go away, through having trained it before. So it becomes more familiar, even if it's still anxiety producing, and we can develop those skills to perform under pressure, even if the pressure doesn't disappear. That's not the goal. It changes our relationship with pressure, meaning that we can view it as something to just accept and get along with, as opposed to something we have to fight against. It can also increase the quality of training, so the intensity at which we train, because not all athletes are motivated all the time to give 100% constantly. And that's true, and that's right. That's why we also need to be careful with pressure manipulations, that we're not doing it constantly all the time. Otherwise, athletes are always getting stressed out. The intensity will be too high because we also need to periodize and load manage our sessions. They'll stop caring. We don't need every session to be totally stressful, exhausting. There were some limitations to this study. Most predominantly was that it was a pretty tiny sample size. So it was 8 and 8. We had 16 people in total, and it was a qualitative study. Qualitative doesn't mean bad, but in this case, with 16 participants, they were all at the elite and international level. It would be interesting to do different performance levels. And the sports psychologists who were interviewed previously had experience with pressure training and pressure manipulations, meaning that they actually liked them also. So it would have been really interesting to see different levels, different countries, with different experiences, what they all say to pressure training, even if they're not super experienced with it, or if they are experienced with it and don't like it a whole lot, or have had maybe negative experiences. That would have been really interesting as well. Self-report in retrospect is always difficult, so that's always a general limitation. Because these athletes and sports psychologists were not in the moment doing a pressure manipulation, theoretically it was self-report because they were telling us about it. It's not something that we scientists observed, and it was in retrospect. That's not always entirely accurate. Sometimes we got to kind of take that for what it is, but again, it's a good start. This study also, just by its nature, couldn't give any proof, especially empirical evidence, for any one specific pressure manipulation. It's always specific to the sport, specific to the team, to the athletes, to the culture, to the stress level, and to that training session. So it's not like we could say penalty kicks with a leaderboard that's posted on Facebook is the most accurate, helpful, efficient pressure manipulation for soccer players between the ages of 17 and 20. We cannot say that at all. It's always going to be specific, and even these authors really encouraged coaches to be more creative and adapting pressure manipulations instead of just taking random ones that they've seen from others, but actually adapting it to their team. Coaches can also use pressure manipulations to really improve the quality of performance massively and the intensity, and increase that sense of importance of the training session. Again, the psychological variables are super important, so trying to mirror the psychological aspects is very valuable. The physiological aspects are still helpful even if it's less intense than actual competition. We don't need to be killing them for 90 minutes in order to induce pressure. Pressure training can be an awesome place for sports psychology to emerge in training, where athletes might have one-on-one sessions or do team workshops or have inputs from sports psychologists here and there. They can actually work on those coping mechanisms, like in reality, in their own training right there on the pitch or on the court or wherever they are through pressure training. However, the authors also explicitly say multiple times that it is most helpful when it is explained to the athletes and not just the athletes are thrown into a pressure manipulation. It is introduced, it is explained, and slowly increased. It's not just, there's a huge pressure manipulation, it's really exhausting, and on day one, we're throwing them in the deep end. No, please explain it to them, explain the purpose. We're not taking anything away from the efficiency of the pressure manipulation by explaining it to the athletes, and it can also create more buy-in. Pressure training is also an important place where we focus on learning from mistakes. Like, even though there's a consequence, even though something happens, even though it's anxiety and pressure inducing and we want a good performance out of it, we're still trying to use this experience to bring a better performance, to learn from mistakes, from errors, and not just be embarrassed and shameful by it. If that's all your pressure manipulation does, you're doing it wrong. So that was study number 2. I really liked that study. I found it helpful, and I sent it to all the coaches that I know because we need to get better about introducing these slowly and early in performance. It's not something that I see a ton actually well implemented. A lot of times it's just the physiological aspects of running them to their dead until they're exhausted. Consequences like you got to clean the bathroom or you got to cook. And so making it more specific, making it more applicable, and also getting the buy-in from the players is so important. Explain to them why we're doing something and why we need them to do it with us. Study 3 by Feng et al., 2022. This article is called The Impact of Sport Training on Adaptations in Neural Functioning and Behavioral Performance, a scoping review meta-analysis on EEG research. That is a title. And then the goal of this research is to provide more evidence on like the neural underpinnings basically of sports performance functioning. And they did a meta-analysis of studies comparing athletes to non-athletes in sport tasks and general tasks, as well as a couple of other things to see if athletes are like neurally superior or if they have superior brain functioning. I really hate the word superior. I don't feel like that's actually helpful in any way whatsoever, but if they maybe have a more efficient brain functioning. A big grounding for this study was that there's so much current interest in improving reaction times, in cognitive performance, in practical neuroscience, in neuroscience in general, like the neuroscience field, the actual neuroscience field, not like neuroathletic or anything like that, but the actual neuroscience field has grown exponentially. It has exploded in the last decade, 20 years even, and that means we need more studies, especially comparing athletes to non-athletes and looking a little more specifically about how things work with athletes, like what are the benefits? And my question is, do athletes have more efficient processes and systems, or do people who have these more efficient processes and systems then tend to become the high-performance athletes? I don't know, that's what we're trying to find out. Neuroimaging has also gotten a ton easier. We have fMRI, we have PET, EEG, like you name it, we got it. We've gotten a lot better in the last several decades with how we can actually look into our brains. This specific study is looking at brainwaves specifically. They're looking at betas, alphas, and thetas. They didn't find very much on delta and gamma waves. Again, this is just a meta-analysis. This is data from previous studies that's being reviewed and compared the effect sizes. This is not original research. This isn't their own data. Previous meta-analyses have actually found more efficient functioning and higher cognitive performance in athletes over amateurs versus non-athletes, but there's very few EEG studies. That's why this one caught my attention specifically. At the end of their meta-analysis, they had a total of 423 participants after all of these studies and all of that data, 225 of which were athletes and 198 were non-athletes, and these are from a variety of sporting backgrounds. They weren't able to narrow that down at all. And here they compared the findings of the alpha, theta, and the beta waves. The theta wave, which is correlated with attentional processes, studies reported a higher frontal theta power and greater oscillations during both motor, so moving, and cognitive tasks. And the conclusion was that athletes have developed actually more efficient strategies for allocating attention in complex tasks. In the second one, the alpha wave, they noted in athletes a lower ERD, which is event-related desynchronization. This suggests basically that there's an increased cortical activation in response to certain stimuli, and then the rest, so like in one specific area, it'll light up, and then the other areas are inhibited. For energy, of course, great. We can inhibit the parts that we don't necessarily need right now. So this also links back to this theory that athletes are a bit more neurally efficient. In the beta band, which is for motor processing, they found a greater ERD, so increased excitability of M1. Our motor cortex. In athletes, this was more prevalent than in non-athletes, and this seemed to produce beneficial effects on behavioral performance on sport tests and shorter reaction times on cognitive tests. Athletes who were experts on a certain task, they had more asymmetrical activation in their hemisphere, so that would mean like the left hemisphere was significantly more activated than the right hemisphere. And this goes back to this ERD, so back to the alpha and beta waves, like what's not needed for experts might actually be inhibited, and that makes them then more energy efficient as well. But in the non-experts, both sides of the brain were then lit up. So not just the left, but the right. They were more symmetrical than the experts. Athletes outperform non-athletes in sport-related tasks. No shock, even if it wasn't sport specific to their sport, but they perform similarly on general tasks. So that kind of goes against that athletes are just far more gifted at everything, and their neurological processes are far superior to everyone, because in general tasks, everybody's the same. But athletes recruit in general fewer neural resources in order to get done what they need to get done, which says they are precise and they have an efficiency and precision of timing over their cortical activation, which non-athletes don't seem to have in some tasks. Limitations here, pretty big. All studies here were cross-sectional, so that's insufficient for causality. We cannot actually infer anything out of that. We can just say that things are related. We also have the nature versus nurture debate. So like, does sport training improve function? Or do people who function better, faster, more efficiently then become athletes, as I asked at the beginning? The third one is that the sample size was not perfect. It still needs tons more research to validate. The practical applications on this one are a little bit hard because this is so very science-based, this is so very data, and we need more research. So if you're a researcher and this is for you, then this practical application is for you. It seems like athletes are more efficient in some ways at managing their attention, their energy, their cortical activation, their timing on some tasks than non-athletes, but we are not sure. We need more research, especially EEG research. That would be really, really cool. And we also need it with different types of sports, but also the same sport. That would be great across different levels of expertise, like really, really expert athletes with 10 plus years of experience, 20 years experience, 30 and less. Like, where do we actually reach the level of efficiency? And we also, of course, need to study all the genders, not just the dudes. That'd be great. And we need a control group of non-athletes / amateur athletes always to confirm our suspicions. Otherwise, we do not know what we're talking about. Thanks for joining us on this month's version of articles that we go over on the Tube of You or on Instagram or wherever you're watching this. If you have an article that you'd like me to review, you can send it to me at julia@whitelineperformance.com, or you can drop it in the comments here and I'd be happy to look over it for you. Thanks for watching. Have a good one.